Hi, everyone. Today, I'm very excited to be sitting down and having a chat with Cheryl Hung, who in her most recent role was a VP of Ecosystem at the CNCF. Now, Cheryl, just to get started, people know who you are, but it's always good to get a little bit of background before we get started. Can you just tell us about how you got into this role, what attracted you about working with end users, and what your experience kind of brought to the table?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here, Bart. I've been in, let's say, the kind of cloud native mindset thinking for quite some time. I started off as an engineer at Google, so using Borg. I was a backend engineer writing C++ and then deploying those applications using Borg, and Borg was kind of the internal predecessor to Kubernetes. So I guess you could say I've been thinking in containers since about 2010. Oh, wow. And actually, one of the things that surprised me when I left Google was this is not how the rest of the world builds infrastructure, right? In 2015, Docker was still pretty new, containers were still pretty new. And at that point, I was like, okay, I think I've seen a better way that this can be done. And that's why I was like so excited to move into infrastructure and to bringing this paradigm of cloud native out to more companies and more organizations where it could be useful. So my role at CNCF is really about end users, was about getting those organizations to kind of move away from caring about individual servers, move away from expecting a lot of manual interventions on the part of SREs or DevOps engineers, platform engineers, and moving to this kind of automated, scalable, reliable infrastructure. So yeah, that's kind of how I went from being, I guess you could say, being an end user myself as an application developer to helping other organizations and other companies through the CNCF adopt cloud native.
Good. And with that in mind, do you find that often vendors perhaps have the wrong approach when addressing end users, that maybe they make assumptions, they don't do their homework? What are some common mistakes that you've seen there, and how could those be corrected?
I think vendors have a very difficult job here, to be honest. Most vendors are trying to address a market which is moving very, very fast. And there's a few companies out there. I had the luxury of working with companies who generally understood what cloud native was, who had already started making some moves. But one of the big difficulties is that the vast majority of the world is not there yet. You know, we who kind of live in this world think, oh, everybody knows what Kubernetes is. Everybody knows what a container is. And actually, for the most part, that's not true. And especially given that this is the data on Kubernetes community, especially when it comes to storage, you know, when you're in storage, things move even slower, let's say, than moving compute or moving networking. So I think the challenge for vendors' point of view is to really, really get into the mindset of the end users and not just say like, okay, here is our tool, use it, but there's still a big education phase before we can get to that point. You know, what are the actual problems and the challenges? Why is it different within cloud native compared to what you saw before? And then the other big challenge is understanding regulatory needs and regulatory compliance, because that's not really well understood, I would say, by vendors.
That makes sense. And so for vendors that do want to approach, an end user and to start interacting, maybe asking some questions, because you're going to get into, legal compliance, NDAs, due diligence, all of those things that have to be taken care of, as you mentioned, regulatory things. What are some first steps or best practices, regardless of the sector, or maybe we can take it more specifically to certain sectors that you think that vendors could keep in mind if they want to start going down that end user path?
I think going in with empathy, going in with understanding that the end users have a very different way of looking at the world, right? End users are primarily there to solve their own business problems, create their own business value, and they want to focus their attention on the things that differentiate them as a business. So as a vendor, your challenge is to understand their needs, not to sell your solution or to say that, you're the best in this market. So if I were a vendor and I were approaching a new customer, I would sit down and I would explore with them, why have you made the decisions that have taken you to where your infrastructure is today? and what are the trade-offs that you're making right now between, your infrastructure, processes, and people, typically. And you need to understand all three of those, because all three of those will play into how end users make decisions about what they're going to use. So I would go in and I would really come from a place of empathy and understanding those first. And then I would educate people on, okay, these are the problems. Like, once we've understood your problems, these are the problems that come up generally in, this area. And this is how you can think about different ways of solving those problems. I think far too many vendors, and this is not a dig against vendors, I just want to say, but it's too easy when you're in your own world to say, okay, this is our solution, take it or leave it, And I think the challenge is like, okay, how should people think about the challenges that they're facing? And then how does the solution that this vendor is providing fit into those things? Because things are never made in isolation. Decisions are never made in isolation. End users are always going, well, yes, we could use this particular tool, but we have a regulatory need. We have this piece of infrastructure that we chose 5-10 years ago that we've never updated, and that's super critical, and that still needs to work with it. Or we have a future project to move everything to multi-cloud. So, by asking these kind of questions, you'll figure out what constraints that will put on the solutions. And I think that is the best way to kind of get into that end user mindset.
Mm-hmm. As well as very much what you said regarding trade-offs is having to accept the fact that you need to be helping folks make an informed decision, and no solution is going to be perfect. And so being honest about that, being upfront about that, and like you said, really applying empathy. One of the things that I always try to, bring in a very human way is think about, we all have difficulties, frustrations. Every solution should be trying to remove some kind of suffering. So what is that suffering, and how am I addressing it? And how is this going to improve the quality of life of this end user so that they can do their job better and reach those business goals? Now, moving it a little bit more towards the data on Kubernetes side of things, because one of the things you mentioned is people, right? And one of the things that we've seen is, and companies say, whether it's data on Kubernetes or Kubernetes in general, the lack of qualified practitioners on both sides, both for vendors as well as end users. How do you see that being addressed? Obviously, we have great things being done through certifications, through different training programs, but in order to get, a solid block of folks moving in the right direction, what are the things that need to be happening? Because one of the things we hear a lot about is with data on Kubernetes, is it a talent problem? Is it a money problem? Let's try to unpack that a little bit. What do you think about that?
It is absolutely. There is a desperate need for skills and experienced talent here. So I absolutely agree with that. And the kind of quote unquote easy solution is to point to training and certifications. And CNCF offers a handful of those as well, which are quite popular. But on the flip side of that, training and certifications only go so far, right? Like, I think we all know that doing a couple of hours of some tests does not really kind of train you to be able to work with that and to understand all the problems day to day. I think one of the companies that I've spoken to, who they're actually a consultancy, but one of the things that I think they are looking at is bringing in more kind of student graduates, people earlier in their career, and kind of giving them that exposure to cloud native from a slightly earlier time. I think in infrastructure, certainly in DevOps, people tend to get into it from some other path. So they come in, they start out as IT support, they started as a sysadmin, they start as a developer, and then they kind of move towards DevOps. And so DevOps engineers tend to be a little bit more further along in their career, right? So I think the idea of making that a choice from the beginning, making that an option from the beginning, it's kind of a nice way to bring up the talent pool, not just for today, but for, the next couple of years, the next 5 years or so, which I actually really love. I've met a couple of students now who've said, they have never deployed anything other than in a container.
Wow.
And I'm like, that's pretty cool.
That's a good
Pretty
sign.
cool.
That's a good sign.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like a few years ago, that would have been quite unimaginable, right? But now there really are, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are really in this mindset from day one. And that gives them the time and the comfort with these new technologies.
Yeah. Whereas others, like you said, more seasoned practitioners having to make those paradigmatic shifts later in their careers obviously is difficult because you have to, unlearn and then relearn. But like you said, seeing a younger generation of, cloud natives starting from an earlier age, I think is a really positive sign. And we see that through having the student interns in our community and lots of young people. And we explain learning data on Kubernetes is not easy and it's going to take time, but that's why we have a community of practice. Because like you said,
yes,
the certifications are there and that's great because it provides a framework. But really, when you're able to interact with other folks, and also people love having questions asked and being able to answer them. So that's a really, really positive experience. Now,
I do think
go ahead.
I do agree with you that the community side of things is very important as well, especially in an area like this, which is changing all the time. The best way that you're going to learn is to meet other people who are doing the same thing and learn from them, get to know them, and then share what you have learned with other people as well. That kind of peer-to-peer learning is super, super important.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. As someone who looks very strongly at trends and is very much in touch with things that are going on, data on Kubernetes has not been featured yet in one of your predictions, and that's okay because we know that it's still kind of early days. What are the things that you think need to happen as someone who does have a background in storage for this to become, I don't want to use the word mainstream because then it's not cool, but something that's not so at, at the fringes, let's say. What are the things that you think need to happen in order for this to become easier, in order for people to see the value? Because one thing is what and how to do data on Kubernetes, but another question is why. What do you think about that?
So let me go back a little bit in time because you mentioned I do have a background in storage. And one of the previous roles that I was in was a company called StorageOS, which was doing persistent storage for Kubernetes. And I joined them in January of 2017. And I thought at that time that there was maybe 18 months, in 18 months' time, this would be a solved problem. And I was probably a little bit optimistic, to be honest, because now we are, 4 years later? And I would say we're probably
a long 18 months. Yeah, I mean, who's counting?
Yeah, exactly. We're still not quite there yet. So I've always been I was pretty bullish about it. I was like, yeah, 2017, we'll have this all figured out in the next year or two. And actually, that hasn't played out as quickly as I expected. I think that setting aside the fact that, as we already talked about, cloud native, there's still a lot of companies and people out there who actually are not very familiar with it. And, you have to get them on that journey long before they're going to start thinking about data on Kubernetes. The other challenge is just that companies are extremely conservative about their data. And they're absolutely correct too, because you cannot lose, 1% of your data. That it's just a hard problem. You have to get it correct. You have to get it perfect. And that's actually while at CNCF, we launched the Technology Radar, which is a quarterly report where we do talk about what are the current challenges that people are facing. And it's based on the technology report from ThoughtWorks, which is like circular rings that tell you which technologies are up and coming versus which ones are immature or people are not using anymore. So we kind of borrowed that concept to look at trends within cloud native from end users. And in November of 2020, we did publish a report on databases with Kubernetes. So not data generally, but databases. And we asked people, well, what do you actually use right now? What would you recommend to other people? And what things do you no longer use? And it was very interesting. I mean, one of the findings that we got from that is that the kind of top level, the most adopted, most widely recommended tools are still things like MySQL, Postgres, Kafka, things that have been around for some time, and they're not specifically cloud native. And things that are, let's say, Cockroach DB, like that is still pretty new, and people are still pretty early stages in thinking about it. So I would say that the biggest challenge let's not say it's missing. Let's not say that it's like not there yet, but one of the challenges is just that data is fundamentally a hard problem. It's a hard problem, and there is no scope to get it wrong. So companies don't want to take that risk yet.
Yeah. So we can say maturity levels, sort of experience with it, let sleeping dogs lie, like that sort of way of looking at it. But then once again, is that looking at the advantages, and this is something that's come up, now we've done over 82 live streams. So we've had lots of different practitioners from lots of different backgrounds, sectors, et cetera, coming in. And one of the things that they'll say that's been said is, why run data on Kubernetes? For the sake of simplicity, having everything all in one stack rather than having to have separate stacks. There are other reasons that can get in there as well. And the other thing as well too is, what are the solutions that are coming in that are making this simpler? Operators are one thing that's, that's been coming up, and we've had a fair amount of sessions about that. But there are other things as well too. In terms of looking at this landscape, what are things that you find promising that are helping to make things easier so that companies won't see it as adversely of, it's not worth the risk, I don't want to get involved, we can just keep doing things the way we've done up until now. What do you think about that?
Operators was going to be my number one, was the thing that first came into my head. So it's great that you've also seen that same trend in your live streams of other practitioners. I think there is another question I've seen come up a couple of times is how do we do what's the best practices around running multiple databases across multiple teams? Running a single database, I think, is getting there. It's not perfect maybe, but companies kind of understand that, but companies who are, 10 to 50 teams, application teams, and they all have their own kind of sets of databases. And I don't think it's really well understood whether you should be running one gigantic database and how to split the different teams and how to manage access across those teams. I hope that answers.
No, that's fine. But imagining, thinking out loud, like if you can wave a magic wand and make data, running data on Kubernetes easier, what would be like, if I could do this, that would be fantastic as a sort of challenge to the community.
I would say I'll give a tool that I think is a bit underrated. I think that Vitess is a tool that makes transitioning much easier from whatever past infrastructure you have, because you don't have to change from MySQL, although I think they support other databases now, to running that on top of cloud native. I think if more companies looked into Vitess, that would help kind of allay some of the problems, and not the problems, but the worries, the concerns.
Yeah, as a starting point, just understand it can be done. This is one way, and then that sort of opens up the landscape to the other options that are there. In your experience with end users that you've seen that have been working with data on Kubernetes, what were the decisions that led to that? What was their experience? What were the challenges that they faced? What were the perceptions that you got overall?
What I've seen commonly in companies, when I say companies here, I usually talk about mid-sized companies. Okay. So not the really, really big ones, and not like 2-person startup. So let's say tens to hundreds or like low thousands kind of employees. A very, very common pattern that I see is that a handful of engineers across different teams go, I want to start using Kubernetes. I'll spin up my own cluster. I'll try something that's going well. And then a centralized team comes in and says, okay, this is getting messy. We need to figure out a company strategy for this. So we're going to take over running the infrastructure, Kubernetes infrastructure, and then give you like some kind of golden path, like some kind of blessed set of tools that you can use. And that goes pretty well for a while. Usually at this point, they're just running stateless applications. And then a little while after that, some number of developers start coming in and saying, well, now we need to start thinking about how to put data within Kubernetes, but we are constrained because of X, Y, Z. As I said, sometimes that's regulatory stuff. Sometimes that is a company mandate, like, we don't want to use RDS because it's too expensive. And then they go to the centralized infrastructure team and ask them to evaluate the different options that are out there. And again, kind of give them this golden, blessed set of tools that they're going to use for data. And then anything else outside of that tends to not be acceptable. So the challenges that I've seen are very, very, like they vary very much from company to company. But that's the general kind of pattern. That's how the decision-making side of it works. And after that point, then it's usually up to the infrastructure team to compare the different options that are out there.
Yeah. And when you talk about the technology decisions, who are the stakeholders that are going to be there? You mentioned developers, sort of arriving to the table, because we see that, is it a top down? Is it a bottom up? And as you said, it varies from company to company, but in some situations, what are the typical sets of stakeholders that you'll see there that are going to be saying, why don't we consider this? Or maybe this could actually provide extra value.
So I have somewhat strong opinions on this, because I think that developers, and when I say developers, I mean application developers, because that's, again, my own background. Application developers generally don't care about infrastructure. They don't want to care about infrastructure. For them, they just want it to be a solved problem. They can forget about it and they can work on their own applications. So while a developer might come and say, okay, like I need to spin up, Postgres on whatever, they're not going to be the people who are going to solve. They're not going to be those people who are going to solve it across the whole organization. From their point of view, once they've solved it once, they'll move on and look at other things. I think it usually comes from that central infrastructure team or platform team or cloud team, whatever you want to call it. They're the ones who are going to be making the final technology decisions. And then there is usually, people who sign off budget and contracts and legal and that kind of thing. But from my point of view, I think the centralized infrastructure team are the main stakeholders, because they're not solving this for a single person or for a single team. They're solving this for 5, 10, 20 teams. And that is the point when it's worth it to bring in an external solution that makes everything easier.
And that's a really good point. And one of the things that we talk about in our community as well, because you mentioned those infrastructure teams, platform teams, et cetera, the growing role of the DBRE, the database reliability engineer. Keeping that in mind, how do databases fit into the cloud native framework or landscape to begin with? And what do you think about that role as it starts to grow more and more? It's not common to see on LinkedIn or in other places that someone, self-identifies as a DBRE, but we are seeing that more and more. Obviously, there are, books and other resources coming out about it. How do you think that role is going to evolve, and what role will that play as data on Kubernetes becomes more commonplace?
So that's actually fascinating to me, because DBRE is a role that I've heard of, but I actually don't know anybody who's doing that role directly. And I'm sure you do, because this is the community.
Yes, what we're doing, yeah.
So actually, I would kind of love to just ask you, get your thoughts on it. Do you think this is an actual trend? Right now, I just seem to hear about it in the wind.
That's a good question. We had a wonderful talk in our last KubeCon event from Patrick McFadden from DataStax, talking about, the road from DBA to SRE. So the idea that, and also in my personal experience, I can't speak for anybody else's, DBAs in general, I would consider it to be a very traditional kind of role, and very, very focused on a specific set of issues. And it's kind of like, if it's not related to my stuff, I'm not interested in hearing about it. But I think you've also seen that sort of, I don't want to say friction, but transitions with DevOps about telling developers, actually, you do need to be thinking about infrastructure and you do need to, have ownership in this. So I think kind of expanding it out, bringing those database folks that were traditionally kind of siloed into the equation while introducing some things regarding SRE principles. And I haven't read the DBRE book and it's on my reading list. So I have that as homework. But like I said, and this is something that we've asked about as well. Given the different certifications that are happening, would it make sense to have a DBRE certification at some point? But then the response that I've got is like, well, because each database is so different, you would either have to test for all the databases or just do it database by database. So yeah, that's kind of how I've sort of looked at it. Going back to the original point too of how many people do we see on LinkedIn or on Twitter, saying I'm a DBRE? Few and far between. It's growing. I think it's the same thing with SRE. It's like, is it a role or is it a set of practices? And I can get in a lot of trouble depending on how I answer that question, right? But and the same with DevOps. Am I a DevOps or I do DevOps? These sort of philosophical debates that go back and forth. So I do think though that, as you said, with infrastructure teams, with cloud platform teams, this issue of databases is going to be even stronger and will be sort of inseparable from teams as they tackle those different challenges. My question sort of is from what you've seen on the end user side of things, is it the same? Once again, you see this be as the infrastructure team, the cloud platform teams that are making these decisions, with database folks sort of being outside of the equation or being brought in as well? What do you think?
I think I've started to, again, because I don't know any kind of direct DBREs directly, my impression is that the infrastructure teams tend to kind of learn and pick up a bit of database stuff when they need to, rather than having individuals who are specialized on the database side at the moment.
Yeah. But
again, that's only from the companies that I've talked to and the end users that I've seen. So I haven't seen that exact, the same trend. But funny enough, like I have seen what you mentioned about certifications where we asked, well, at CNCF, we thought, should we be doing something database based? And the answer was like, well, which database, or how do you choose which databases to test?
And then you get a lot of trouble because the Postgres people won't be interested in the other one, or this, vice versa. And yeah.
It is a challenge for sure. But yeah, I don't think that at the moment, I said just from 2021 where we are today, I don't think that I've seen so many database specialized people in cloud native.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. And speaking of that as well too, and now taking it, more towards the open source angle, like this is something we very much focus on in our community is, working with data on Kubernetes, using open source technologies, and also as well as our relationship with the CNCF. Are there any challenges you think that are particularly stand out right now for folks that are really, really committed to working with open source, where perhaps do you think that there could be limits, or that the proprietary folks are offering different solutions? How do you kind of see that, what do we want to call it? I hate to use the word ecosystem so much, that sort of environment. How do you see that those kind of interactions of open source versus proprietary and the different things going on there, particularly as someone who's been very involved in the CNCF?
So with these interactions, are you talking about using, or are you talking about contributing?
I would say using.
Okay, using. I think there's been quite a shift, a field change in the last few years, where open source is now pretty widely accepted and widely understood. That is not the challenge anymore. I think if we talked about this, 5 years ago, I think I would have been like, oh, executive education and getting people to understand what open source is. I feel like we've kind of crossed a hump in that one. So that's like a challenge that used to exist, no longer, not so much nowadays. Although I did have a fascinating conversation with someone who asked whether they needed to be a member of CNCF in order to use the open source projects, because otherwise CNCF would sue them for using Kubernetes, and we were like,
were they from the United States? Perhaps I'm saying fear of a lawsuit is generally an American ailment, but
I think they were possibly United States. I remember they were in the oil and gas industry,
okay,
so a very traditional, traditional industry. But vast majority of other companies, I'd say, are over that initial hump of like open source is not something that we're going to get sued over.
Yeah.
I think the challenge now with using open source in a corporate setting is understanding the long-term impact for the company. So on the technical side, if you're going to pick a technology, if you're picking from vendors, you probably have 5 options, maybe 4 to 5 options, and you understand how much support they're going to provide for you. You're going to have a person sort of nudge on roadmap and on features. Open source, you have 1,000 options and you have nobody that you can really do that for. So, or you can really ask for. So from a technological and people and company perspective, they're two very different scenarios. And I think most companies will use a mix of both. I don't think there are very few companies that I could think of that are going to be adamantly one way or the other. It depends on what technology they're using and what are the options out there.
Yeah, but sort of as a general style or approach, like let's diversify a little bit, mix match here and there, depending on our use case and the challenges that we're facing. That seems to make sense. But talking about more traditional, as you mentioned, traditional companies, Oracle stands out, and for some it can be a love-hate, it can be a big target, things like that. But recently seeing in June, the tweet from Kelsey Hightower talking about him saying, like, I never thought I'd be saying this, but here we are working with Oracle on Kubernetes using an operator called Evcaro. And that seems to be making some waves, also showing that is Oracle up to the challenge of getting on Kubernetes, really be going cloud native, and obviously that they're active in different areas and in different ways. Is this something that you find promising to see firms that traditionally had maybe been sort of outside these spaces now being brought in? Do you expect more to do so? Do you think that some won't make the cut? How do you see that playing out in the next few years?
I think it's a really good trend. In a sense, I'm not overly surprised that it is happening because cloud native is just that big now. It's at the point where companies are like, well, if we don't get on cloud native, we're going to be left behind. We're going to be the old hat, the ones that don't work with this. So there's a bit of peer pressure, let's say, among companies to start moving on to cloud native. I think the challenge for companies who are thinking about it comes back to that question about earlier, like, do you have the people who have the right mindsets and ways of thinking about and the right experience with cloud native? Because it's really easy to get cloud native wrong, right? I've seen quite a few companies who've said, oh, we've chose this, we overextended ourselves in it, and then we decided, 6 months or a year down the line that this was not the right way to go. So we chucked it out and we started again.
And what were the problems there? Like you said, maybe mindset, expectations. What caused that getting cloud native wrong?
Complexity a lot of the time. So for instance, Istio, pretty well-known service mesh, and showed a lot of promise and people got behind it. And then I've heard, probably more than any other tool I can think of, I've heard people say, we changed our mind about Istio because it was too complicated for us to use it. And that's kind of my, a little bit of concern as well. Like there's so much hype around cloud native. There's so much hype around certain tools within cloud native that companies may choose to go behind it blindly, not really thinking about, is this really solving our needs? Is this going to be too complex? Is this going to add too much overhead for the problems we're going to solve?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Doing your homework, and we saw this as well too. Like I always go back to this example. I worked at a software development firm that was growing very, very quickly, and they moved everything to the cloud. This was 7 or 8 years ago, in about 3 months. And it was incredible, the migration, that it was done that fast. There were people in 3 different countries working on it simultaneously. But doing that was one thing. Actually having the mindset and mentality necessary to manage all these things. And once again, people, not just, DBAs, but developers that had come from, we can say, a quite traditional background. And the paradigmatic shift of running into that new scenario, they simply weren't ready for it. And the costs then showed it. They were spending, I think it was £250,000 a month on cloud infrastructure, and it was completely out of control. And so what I think is important is that it doesn't mean that you have to be overly conservative, but it doesn't mean you have to be overly aggressive. I think one of the best ways too is, once again, there's a community that can support you. Other people have done this before. Did they have the exact same characteristics as your company? Maybe, maybe not. But at least if you're going to spend this much time and money on it, at least have a few conversations with some folks out there, other end users. And I think that's why the radar and the other things that you were talking about are very beneficial to make that transition easier and smoother. For companies that want, with that in mind, for companies, as someone who understands what data on Kubernetes is, for companies who want to start making that transition, what would be things that you would say are necessary? Like, if you're going to start getting into data on Kubernetes, we can say, as you mentioned earlier, infrastructure, people, and processes. What would be key ingredients to make the transition more successful?
Actually, I love the fact that you brought up the fact that, again, you should get into the community, get into understand what other people have done. Look at reports like the Tech Radar, which are neutral or kind of independent, and they kind of cut through the hype and kind of give you that ground truth reality about what people are actually using right now, what they care about, and what they recommend and what they don't recommend. So I would say, like, start with that. Yeah, do your research, do your homework, just see what, get your head out of your own company and look at what else other people use, talk to them, understand what their challenges have been. And then I think choosing infrastructure, choosing tools is not that hard, in the sense that you can run something you can pick a handful of tools, spin them up within, a couple of weeks to a couple of months, play with them for a little bit. I think understanding the day to operations, that is a much harder task. And that's a cultural thing. That is getting people to understand, what do you need to be doing day to day, week to week for these tools. And I think if you can bring in your company's culture early in that, so bring that, understand what that means, then I'll give you an example here. Adidas, the sportswear company, they're fully in on Kubernetes. And as a sports company, they were very competitive, or they're very kind of competitive as a company, right? And they chose to run a series of kind of hackathons among different teams to onboard as quickly as possible, onboard those teams onto Kubernetes. And because there was that company mentality or company culture of, we have a scoreboard, we have leaderboards, we see how different teams stack up against each other. That worked out really, really well for them. So in other companies, I would sort of reflect on, well, what are your company values and cultures, and how can you use that to make that transition easier?
Yeah. So I think that's a good point too, is that while there is the outward sort of, looking, there's also the inward sort of looking of what are the things that we've done before in terms of transitions that can help us be better prepared for this one. And also using your values and the experience in your team as sort of fuel to move forward in that direction. I think that's a really, really good point. Okay. So just kind of, getting towards the end, once again, you talk a lot about trends. Are there any things that, that you're looking forward to seeing in the next coming years that you think we should keep an eye on without getting too heavy duty into predictions? Just things that you're excited about that in terms of what's going on in the cloud native landscape.
I mean, to be honest, I still am excited about storage, I think, and databases. Like, as I said, I think I was a bit optimistic back in 2017 to think that
you can still be optimistic. Don't worry.
I am still optimistic about it. It does feel like we're at the point now when, cloud native Kubernetes are pretty well established. People are moving on to the next challenge, and stateful applications is not a solved problem. So there's still lots and lots of scope and lots of opportunity to make that happen. But outside of storage and databases, I did a prediction, a couple of posts about predictions, like my 10 predictions for 2021 in cloud native. So a couple of things that on a personal level that I think are really exciting there. I would love to see more chaos engineering practices, more companies adopting those. I would love to see more, we talked about cloud cost management.
Oh yeah.
FinOps, like that's a definite trend, and I think one that I expect to see more of as well. Yeah, and then just generally more end user participation in the overall ecosystem. We're kind of trying to encourage that now so that it doesn't become a vendor dominated conversation. And I think end users have a lot of experience that they can share with other people, and oftentimes they don't even realize it, and I think having that confidence for people to share their stories and share their experience, that's a big trend that I hope to see continue.
And like you said, and that obviously there is a tech component, but a lot of it is empathy driven. So, and because I think everybody wants end users, to be involved, because it lends more credibility. If it's just vendors shouting about the same thing, then it's just, you're kind of surrounded by that kind of mindset and that kind of message. So I think that's definitely a thing. And you've obviously worked very hard on doing that. So I congratulate you for your dedication, because it's not an easy job. I think everyone will say is like, we would love to be having end users every single time. And that's something that our community is very committed to building out. And so I very much take that to heart on the empathy side, and also all the other insights that you mentioned about really trying to understand their problems, and also, pushing them to understand that they have more expertise in certain areas than the vendors. You might think that the vendors are one step ahead, but actually the end users are really tackling these things. And if, as we say in the US, if it doesn't make dollars, it doesn't make sense. If it's not helping their final business goals, that's not going to be something that's going to stick around very long. So I think that's a very, very strong point. Anything else that you would like to leave us with as a final thought regarding how we can all be more end user focused?
I think we've actually covered quite a few different topics today, and I think I have different things that I would want to reflect upon as well. Like I do want to see if DBRE becomes a real trend. But yeah, on the end user piece, I would say it's hard, but it is really worth doing. If you can spend more time with end users, understanding their problems, you'll be able to build better solutions for them. So it's not easy, but it's worth doing.
Yeah. And so build that into your strategy. Don't just let it be something else that's being done by other folks. Take advantage of things like the Tech Radar and all the stuff that the CNCF is doing. And once again, engage in community activities, ask questions, get involved. What somebody told me a long time, the no you already have. You can only hope to get a yes answer, and to make that first step and engage with folks and be patient and not be too aggressive. Well, Cheryl, I think we have a lot of stuff that we can extract from this interesting conversation. Thank you very, very much for your time. Wishing you all the best in your next step. We'll definitely be in touch. And once again, thank you very much for sharing your time with us today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Bart.
Likewise. Cheers.